It's nice to be here. I've talked to this group before over the years about various things, and I thought it would be good today to talk about a couple of things we've done related to groundwater in the Centr region, a couple of projects that we've had involved with looking at private water supplies, and those of you that know me know that I've talked about those for a long time. I've worked at Penn State for going on 27 years now, and a lot of my career has focused on private drinking water supplies, people that have their own wells, their own springs, and their own cisterns. And also some work we've done on Roadside springs, which is a little bit newer. We haven't done a lot with that in the past, but finding some interesting things with that. Do I switch slides? Okay. This was normally going to be a little audience participation, so I'm just going to ask you these questions. Normally you'd have little clickers and it would actually show the responses, but I'm just wondering how many of you have public water in here? So almost there. Anybody have private water? Let's put it that way. Okay, Todd, you do. I know you do. Okay, just two of you. Okay. And I know you're on a well also? Okay. In Pennsylvania, if you're not already familiar, and I know some of you are, but we have lots of groundwater wells and springs. We're second only to Michigan as far as the number of people that have a private water system. Michigan's number one, Pennsylvania number two. We have over 1 million homes, about 3.5 million people that use these type of water supplies. In Centr County, we don't have real good data on it, but based on the best available data, we would estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of 11,000 residents have, 11,000 residences, homes, have a private water system. About 19% of the county residences. About 69% of those would be drilled wells, about 22% springs, which is actually fairly high. When you look at the state as a whole, springs tend to be more in the order of 5%, but in some of these northern counties, especially northern part of Centr County, we do see a lot of springs, and when you get up into the northern tier, you pick up counties that really have a very high percentage of springs as their private drinking water supplies. And then we get 9% hand-dug wells. I have a drilled well now, which I could tell lots of stories about, and I had a hand-dug well when I used to live out on Sellers Lane in Patton Township. I can tell you hand-dug wells, I could probably tell you more stories about that one because that's a true experience to have a hand-dug well. That's literally where somebody started digging with a shovel to create a very large diameter hole, and my grandfather had one too. He dug it himself back in the early 1900s, about 8 to 10 feet across. They're usually 30, 40 feet deep, and rabbits fall in them and skunks. I always knew when there was something in my hand-dug well because the water would start to smell, and I'd go out and pull the cover off, and there'd be something dead down in the well. So a lot of people have, of course, gone away from them over time, but there's still a significant number of them, and they tend to be with very old homes because they were usually dug around the turn of the century. We know from a lot of research that many of these water supplies have never been tested, and many of them that have been tested have not really been properly tested by a state-accredited laboratory, and even a lot of the ones that have been tested have only been done for bacteria. So a lot of cases, there's a lot of unknowns about the water quality. People have really never checked into it very much. And one of the things that's been happening in a lot of counties where shale is occurring, or shale is being drilled, there's a lot more testing going on, and so people are becoming more familiar with their background water quality. We are one of the only states that do not regulate them. That message has, I get tired of saying that actually, because I've been on that soapbox for a long time about how we don't have private water system regulations. We really need them. Okay, we really need those regulations, but unfortunately we still don't have any regulations to dictate the construction, the location, the certification of drillers, and so forth. And there's a lot of reasons why that's come up for votes many times in the legislature and has always been defeated or never even gotten to a vote in most cases. So everything's really voluntary with these private systems, all the management of them. This is a schematic that's in a new book that was put out by a nonprofit group working with shale gas drilling that has a nice schematic of a typical water well system where you have a drilled well, and here's our drilled well into the rock. We have the fractures in the rock that provide the water storage in the borehole. We have hopefully a grout seal up here at the top around the casing, which unfortunately a lot of wells don't have in Pennsylvania. We hopefully have a sanitary well cap on top, which again, a lot of wells don't have in Pennsylvania. And then we have a water line running into a pressure tank and then into the home distribution system. So that's a typical water well system that we would have on a residence. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, we don't often see that. So this is what we'd like to see if we go out and look at a well. That's a sanitary well cap with an extended well casing. That happens to be a grouted well also. but we see Maxwell House coffee cans on top of wells. We see cinder blocks and all sorts. I mean, I could show you lots of pictures of really, really ugly water wells here. This happens to be a water well here in Centr County that was a Penn State professor's well. And it was a case where they had an old pit and they had extended the casing up. They started to actually retrofit the well and they never finished it, basically. They just left it like that. And that well was loaded with E. coli bacteria and coliform bacteria. This is one that's in a barn. It's an old bucket around the casing. You can see the wiring here is broken. That well was loaded with contamination. Here's a USGS picture that shows insect infestation underneath well caps, and we see that pretty routinely. USGS did a study where they went around and picked up a bunch of these standard well caps that just bolt on loosely to the casing and found that about half of them had insect infestations under them, and that could lead to bacterial contamination as well. And then we sometimes see things staring back at us when we pick up well caps. That actually happened on my well when I first moved in. We had mice living in the well, and as a result we had a lot of bacterial contamination. They've actually put a UV light system on the well. They didn't go out and look in the well to see what was going on, so we got rid of the mice and never needed the UV light system after that. So they were purely responsible for all the bacteria that we had in our well. Here's one that's an old hand-dug well where they drilled a new well down through the hand-dug well, basically. And that can also cause problems with a lot of contamination of surface water that fills up in that pit and gets down around the casing. And then we have people that are just nervous about their well and build castles around them to try to prevent any of this stuff from, especially after we talk to them and they hear about all these stories, they go out and do things like that. So we have lots of stories, things with poor well construction. We've done surveys of wells around the state and found that 87% have extended casings, which is what we want to see. 13% have completely buried casings. In other words, you can't actually see the well. You have to go dig it up out in the yard somewhere. Only 16% had sanitary well caps. The rest had missing well caps, cinder blocks, Maxwell House coffee cans, standard well caps that are loose fitting. And then we have only 18% that had any evidence of a grout seal around the casing of the well. So a lot of existing issues with construction of the water supplies, which can lead to water quality problems, actually. And we know, based on some of the research that we've done, that well construction does make a difference. We did a study where we went out and looked at the well construction, and then we actually measured the water quality. And specifically, bacteria is one, because it's a surface organism. You would think it's going to be related to well construction. And we saw that wells that had 0 of the 5 things that we look for in a well, and the 5 things being, first of all, a casing, not a hand-dug well, but actually a casing that sticks above the ground, a sanitary well cap, a grout seal, and just a slight slope around that casing to prevent surface water from ponding around it. If we have all those 5 things, the incidence of E. coli bacteria is down less than 10%. If we have none of those 5 things, basically a hand-dug well, we have E. coli of over 35%. And there's somewhat of a relationship between the two there, where as you add more of these components on, you reduce that bacterial contamination down. It does not go to 0. It does not mean if you perfectly construct a water well, you will have no problems with bacteria. There are cases where the entire aquifer has bacterial contamination, and you're just not going to get around it, but it still does help quite a bit to reduce the incidence of that down. If you're not familiar with E. coli bacteria, that I'm sure you've all heard of it, but it's a bacteria that only comes from the intestines of warm-blooded animals. So if you have that in your water, it means you have either human or animal waste getting into the water, whether it's a mouse or your septic system or the nearby dairy cows. Some kind of animal is adding waste into that water. So here in Centr County, what I'll talk about are a couple of things. We have data for almost 500 private wells and springs in the county, and that data comes from a number of sources. We did a study of baseline water quality before Marcellus drilling that had close to 100 water supplies in the county. We also have the Penn State Water Laboratory here on campus that accepts samples in from the public, and we have probably about 250 or so samples that have come in from Centr County there. And we also had another study that we did just this past fall here in Centr County where we offered some free testing, and most of that was done out in the Penns Valley area. I think the majority of the 80 or so people that got testing done were out in that area because that's where the workshops were held. So it's kind of those 3 sources. Of those nearly 500 water supplies, they were all tested between 2007 and 2014, and they were 84% drilled wells, 10% springs, and 6% hand-dug wells. Almost half of these folks, when we asked them, said that they had never tested their water before. So 49% never tested. 36% of them said that they were fairly certain there was something wrong with their water, some sort of water quality problem. And in those cases, when people tell you that, normally it tends to be aesthetic problems. It tends to be things that they can actually see in the water: iron, manganese, rotten egg odor, they smell it; hard water, that they see the scale. Unfortunately, those are usually aesthetic problems that they're aware of. They often are not aware of the health-related pollutants because they don't cause any common symptom to the water. The statistics on them, the wells went from anywhere 12 feet down to almost 600 feet in depth. And I know there are deeper wells than that in Centr County because some of them are right around my house. I know of some 700-foot wells right near me where I live. So the average is about 185 feet. In the state as a whole, when we look at all the data, we find averages of around 170 to 175 feet is pretty typical. The roadside springs that we looked at recently, we had 4 of them in either right in Centr County or nearby. And you may be familiar with some of these. They're pretty well known. One is north of Unionville on Route 504, Rattlesnake Pike, that goes up to Black Moshannon. That's a very popular spring. It's very rare. I go by there a lot, and it's pretty rare that there isn't somebody there collecting water. Another one is Route 45 east of Woodward. That's another very large one. It's actually in Union County. It's across the border, but it's very close to the Centr County line. That's another very large spring, very common to find people there. A smaller one that people are less familiar with, Route 445 near Lamar. It's actually close to my house, but it's a very small spring. It's used by Amish a lot, actually. Most of the time I go by there, if there's somebody there, they tend to be Amish. And then there's another slightly larger spring, and I'm not sure what the route is, but it goes up toward Orbisonia. There's a small spring along the road there that I was unfamiliar with, but PennDOT told me about. And when I went up there, there was a lot of evidence that people had been using that one as well. That was part of a larger roadside spring study that I'll go on here in a moment. As far as the general water quality that we expect from all these groundwater sources, it's of course going to be tied to the geology. And this is another graphic that came out of that same brochure I was telling you about before. But here in Centr County, we have a diversity of bedrock types. So we have the sandstone and shales up on the plateau, which produce very different water quality than we get in the carbonate valleys down here in the State College area and Penns Valley and the Bald Eagle Valley, which are shown in the dark blue. And we even have some of the sand and gravel aquifers right down through the Bald Eagle Valley that produce different water quality also. So when we look at the water quality of all these different water supplies, whether they're wells or springs, we have to look also at the bedrock. That tells us an awful lot about why the water quality is that way, whether it's the hardness or the pH or the alkalinity. Some of the common natural problems that we run into, hardness is one of them. I'm always interested in hardness because it's very much a personal preference, I think. It's really what you're used to. I grew up with hard water my entire life, and so I absolutely hate soft water. It drives me crazy when I go somewhere and there's soft water. But there are people who are the exact opposite and say they hate hard water. They feel like they're showering in gravel when they get out of the shower. And it's hard on their hot water heater and their clothes washer, and all their appliances break down more. So there are sort of these two schools of thought. Obviously, water treatment people want water to be softened, and a lot of other folks prefer hard water. But it's very much a personal preference. There is no drinking water standard for it, per se. It's really just an aesthetic issue that people either like or they don't like. And it's basically the calcium and magnesium that are in the rock itself that are dissolved into the water. And lots of hard water in this area. Anybody that lives in this area probably knows what hard water is. We also run into a lot of iron, especially when we get up into the sandstone and shale aquifers up on the plateau. That can be naturally occurring iron, or it can be related to old coal mining, and that forms an orangish red sediment or a metallic taste to the water. It's harmless, but again, it's an aesthetic issue. Same with manganese, but it causes black staining and is fairly common, again, up in the northern parts of the area. Hydrogen sulfide gas is a harmless gas at normal concentrations, but causes a very strong rotten egg odor. And so again, it's something that people get used to, but if you go into someone's house and they have this in the water, you know it right away. You can smell it, but it is basically harmless. And it is also common in certain shale formations. And then finally, corrosive water, which is one of the more problematic issues that we have, where the water actually attacks the metal plumbing and corrodes the metal. So here's a picture of a blue-green stain. This is actually in a sink of an apartment that I rented years ago. And that blue-green is the copper coming out of the plumbing. So that copper is being pulled right out of the pipe, it dissolves in the water, and then you end up drinking that copper. If there is older solder in that, which would be prior to 1992, we had lead in the solder, so we would also get lead with that copper. And lead is much more toxic than copper. Copper largely just causes taste, but it also can cause gastrointestinal issues. Lead causes all sorts of health problems, especially with infants. And so we get a lot more concern when this is happening in older homes where we might have lead associated with it. But it's a very common problem with lower pH waters, softer waters. So springs tend to be a big issue with this. When we get down here in the valleys with all the limestone, we don't see much corrosive water. It tends to be more where the water's more acidic in the northern part of the county. Health-related issues, these are just some of them. Bacteria is one of the big ones. Coliform bacteria coming from surface runoff or insects, E. coli coming from animals, nitrates from fertilizers and manures and septic systems. I know I've had probably more calls and emails this spring about manure in water than I've ever had. And I think we had some fairly unique characteristics with frozen soils and ice on top of the ground and a lot of manure spreading on top of that. And so I've had a lot of calls about people at least claiming that they had manure problems in their water, and that can be related to manure spreading or fertilizer use on frozen ground and in general all the time. Arsenic coming from naturally occurring rock or from pesticides and industrial sources. Lead coming from corrosion of metals, of old plumbing. Barium can be one component of gas drilling waste. It can also be naturally occurring. And then methane, which we hear more and more about with shale gas drilling. Nothing new. We've always had methane issues in our groundwater, but they're becoming more known about, and we're doing a lot more testing of methane now than we've ever done in drinking water supplies. So if we look at the data here in Centr County and compare it statewide, and we have several surveys statewide that we can compare the numbers to. These are aesthetic issues. We start with corrosion, and corrosivity is less common here in the Centr region than it is statewide. That stands to reason. With the limestone that we have, we tend to have less corrosive water, especially in the valleys compared to the northern part of the county. But statewide, it's a very common problem. It's the most common problem that we see is corrosivity of the water. And we have to then ask people what kind of plumbing they have and maybe do some follow-up testing to look for components of their plumbing. Hardness, have an asterisk there because it doesn't have a true drinking water standard, but if we look at the percent of samples that are very hard, above 180 milligrams per liter of hardness, here in Centr County, it's slightly higher than the state average, again, because of the limestone influence that we have. We have a little bit more hard water than in general. We have a little bit less problems with manganese and about the same with iron, a little bit less aluminum. The pH is a little bit more problematic, actually, and we actually have some that are having high pHs in certain places, but also, again, up in the northern part of the county, low pHs below 6.5. And this pH standard, you want it to be between 6.5 and 8.5. And so we have about 20% that lie outside of that range. We have occasional hits with high total dissolved solids, often related to very hard water or to very alkaline waters that have high TDS. We have occasional high sulfate and high chloride as well. And these are each based on sample sizes anywhere from 81 to 410 samples out of those roughly 500 that we looked at. So as you can see, aesthetic problems are not unusual at all. We see them fairly commonly, lots of corrosive water, lots of hard water and metals in the water. These things can all be treated if people choose to. There's not really any problem with that other than the expense of doing it. When we look at health-based problems, coliform bacteria, Centr County, much more prevalent than statewide and probably related to the karst geology and the type of bedrock. It's much more dominant or much more influenced by surface water, and so we see bigger issues with bacteria, more sediment in water after it rains. People are more likely to complain about their water getting muddy or turbid after it rains because of the connection to the surface. So a lot more coliform bacteria and a lot more E. coli bacteria in these private water supplies in this area, much more prevalent. Lead is less common, again related to the lower corrosivity. Arsenic is less common. Nitrate is a little bit more common than statewide, although nothing compared to if you go down and test private water supplies in Lancaster County and Berks County. There, it's everywhere. It's 70% or more of the private water systems have high nitrates, so it's very common in that region of the state. Barium, we didn't find any high in Centr County compared to just a few in the state. Again, methane and bromide, these don't have drinking water standards, which is why they have asterisks. In this case, the methane is just detectable levels of it, which is usually down around 0.05 of a milligram per liter. And we see less of it in Centr County compared to the state if we look at just detectable concentrations. But even there, the detectable concentrations are very rarely high in a natural setting. You very rarely see them over a milligram per liter of methane. And bromide, which is also can be naturally occurring, but also is sometimes related to deep brines or gas drilling wastes as well. And we see detectable levels of bromide are much less common here than they are statewide. It's also interesting to look at water quality types. That makes a big difference, especially when you look at bacteria, but it also is true of corrosivity and hardness and pH, that when you look at springs versus hand-dug wells versus drilled wells, this is just one example. Look at what happens to the bacteria concentration. The coliform bacteria goes down steadily as you go from a shallow spring down to a slightly deeper, perhaps hand-dug well, and then to the deepest drilled wells. The percentages of of coliform bacteria drop way down, as do the percentages of E. coli bacteria. So you can sometimes get around some of these bacteria problems if you have a spring. And what I usually tell people that have a spring is you might as well assume that you have bacteria, because it's very rare that you find springs that don't have coliform bacteria at least, and nearly half of them sometimes have E. coli bacteria. So spring owners especially almost always are going to need disinfection of their private water supply. Is there a question? Okay. And when you get down to drilled wells, you can cut those down significantly. So even drilling wells as opposed to using shallower water supplies may get around a problem with bacteria. Now, here was another participation question, but how many of you have some sort of water treatment equipment, whether it's a softener or a carbon filter or UV light? It's like about almost half of you. And again, I had one myself with a UV light system. When we look at the statistics and we survey people, these other types of water supplies that are occasional, carbon filters, oxidizing filters, so on and so forth. When we did this study back about 7 years ago, the homeowners at least reported an average cost for water treatment of about $1,100 for just purchasing the equipment. That didn't include maintenance, and it also was not adjusted for inflation. So some of these people bought their water treatment equipment in 1970 or 1980. So it's not a true estimate. It's probably low of what the actual cost is. And we did find some cases about 10% of the time where the water treatment systems in the home did not appear to be necessary. In other words, they had a UV light, but they had no bacteria in their raw water. Or they had an oxidizing filter, but they didn't have iron and manganese or hydrogen sulfide. So there were cases where things were there that didn't appear to be necessary. That could be because the water quality changed, or it could be that they were just sold something that they didn't really need in water. So how many of you are willing to admit, at least, that you've consumed water from a roadside spring? Well, good. I have too. Back when I was in college, when we were out doing field work, it was often the only place. That was way before bottled water, so it was about the only place we could find some good tasting water. One thing that we wanted to do last year, actually, we've always wanted to look more at roadside springs because they've always fascinated me. They get used frequently, although we don't really know how much. We've never really done a study of them to find out how many there are, how many people use them. We kind of assume that the water quality is a problem in them, but there's been very little data ever collected on most of them. So they're very much an unknown. I know, at least anecdotally, from my perspective of being a water specialist, I read a lot into what I get from emails and phone calls over the years, and I know that the number of calls and emails that I get where people are being referred to me by physicians has gone up pretty dramatically, where we're looking at things like gastrointestinal illnesses, either bacterial problems or protozoans like Giardia and Cryptosporidium. The incidence of that, at least the ones being referred to me, has gone up from physicians. And when I start talking to those people, they very, very, very often have springs, either their own spring or they are drinking water from roadside springs. And those tend to be more problematic when we're looking at surface-related microorganisms like bacteria and protozoans. There was a study done back in 1990. I was not involved in that, but they did look at 23 roadside springs in northeast Pennsylvania and found that 13 out of those 23 had bacterial contamination. These springs, the construction of them can vary pretty tremendously, but typically what they're going to involve is some sort of a cutoff into a hillside where we have water flowing. We want to capture that water at a trench basically and then pipe it into some sort of a collection device. With a roadside spring, we often don't have this collection device. We basically just have the cutoff here, and then we have a pipe coming out, as you see here, and this is the one out along Route 45 in Union County. And that's a very typical construction. Some of them are very beautiful, actually beautiful stonework done around them, very inviting, basically saying, come on in and drink the water. Look at the beautiful stone here, and it's a very, very aesthetically pleasing site. And often they'll have nice signs there telling you more about when it was developed. So they can be very beautiful and very easy for people to get to and collect water. Generally, when we look at home springs, this is not roadside springs, but we can use it as sort of an index of how common are springs in general. And this is based on census data where we look at homes that are using springs. And they're very common in this region of the state, especially, again, north of here. The counties that are in red have more than 30% of their private water supplies using springs. When we go down to the yellow, which includes Centr County, it's 20 to 30%. Green would be next in the 10 to 20% range. And then the gray and white are basically less than 10%. And so you can generally see that western Pennsylvania has many more springs than eastern Pennsylvania, and especially this sort of north-central cluster up here, especially Potter, Elk, Forest, Clarion counties, really very high percentages. And so we also wonder if that maybe is where most of the roadside springs are. And just in talking to people, it does seem to be true that we have a much higher density of roadside springs in western Pennsylvania than we see in the eastern part of the state. They're still out there in eastern PA, but not nearly to the level we see around here. The General Assembly back in the 1990, again, put out a report through their Joint Legislative Air and Water Pollution Control and Conservation Committee, where they were actually starting to look at roadside springs to consider regulation on them. So this had come up in the past about what should be done, if anything, about roadside springs to regulate them. And they started to do a little bit of homework on trying to find out about the use and the water quality of them. Basically, as a result of that project, or that report, they basically said, A, we need to create an inventory. We need to find out where these things are, how many of them are out there, how big are they, how much are they used, because we don't know any of that. We don't really know, we only can guess. We need to be periodically testing these, at least for microbiological contaminants like bacteria, coliform E. coli bacteria, and they suggested that DEP start doing that. They also suggested that some of the really high-use springs that are in public right-of-ways especially, that they consider disinfecting those or providing disinfection treatment of them to make sure that they were safe for people to use, and especially with high-use springs. And then they said that there should be more public education, and they even named people like Extension, us, that should be out there providing more education about these roadside springs. Not a whole lot of this ever happened, really. I don't know of any inventory that was ever done, and nobody at DEP could ever tell me that there was any done. There was a little bit of testing done shortly after this report and before this report, but nobody knows of any being done any longer on them, at least on any normal scale. There are some examples of disinfection, and I'll show you one of those at least. And there really has been very little in the way of public information about them that's been done. Shroud, the one that's treated, but there is one that we know of down in Westmoreland County that's in a state park, Lynn Run State Park, where they actually, and I did a lot of work there as a graduate student, and I always was curious about it because uphill from the spring where people pull off, there's a little shed up on the side of the hill. And there's no sign or anything about it. There's no sign telling you that the water's treated, but actually they're chlorinating the spring in that shed. So people are driving out from Pittsburgh to get away from their chlorinated public water, coming out to the country to the spring and getting their chlorinated roadside spring water. And they probably would be upset if they knew that, but yet it's still a case where they're trying to make sure that the water meets drinking water standards so they're not liable. Unfortunately, when we tested the water, it still had bacteria in it. So their disinfection system was not functioning properly. And they were going to look into that and try to find out what the problem was. But that's sort of taking it to the full extent where you're actually putting in a treatment system to make sure that the water does meet bacteria standards. In our case, we looked at springs all around the state, but mostly in those areas where you saw the highest density. So we tested them last summer, spring and summer, April through August. We had 7 different people out in 19 counties collecting 35 roadside springs. We actually added one more, so we did 36. And we basically were looking at sites that were within right-of-ways. We talked to the owners of these springs, which basically were PennDOT in most cases, or townships, to find out if it was okay to test them and to actually find out what springs they knew about that we should be out there looking for. So this generally does not include some of the real small springs that are maybe privately owned or along private roads. We really didn't get into testing those. These tended to be larger springs. This is a location of all of them, so you can see, again, how they kind of follow where the density of the private springs was located. Mostly in north central Pennsylvania is where the highest density was. And just some pictures of the ones here locally. This is 3 out of the 4 that are local. So this in the middle here, or the left, is the one out along 45. Here's the one going up Rattlesnake Pike toward Black and Shannon. This is the one going up the small road to Orbisonia. And actually this one it really piqued my curiosity because we have a stream here and we have a pipe next to it. The pipe goes into the mountain there, looks very much like a groundwater spring, but actually when you follow that pipe, it is just stream water. It goes up to the top of the hill into a pool in the stream. So it is purely stream water. It's not a true roadside spring. And if you go actually investigate some of these roadside springs, I've seen other ones like that too, where they're actually just surface water made to look like a roadside spring. And that plays into the water quality as well. They become even more likely then to have problems with bacteria or protozoans. So here's one of our folks collecting samples from one of the roadside springs. These were all returned back to the Ag Analytical Lab here on campus and basically tested for the common bacteria and inorganic parameters that we would do on any drinking water supply. So a pretty good number, 20 different parameters were tested. This is looking at all the roadside springs. So 91% had coliform bacteria out of the 35 that we tested. Almost that number were corrosive. That's really only an issue if you're storing them in something where they could potentially leach that material. So if you put them in something that has metal, it's going to leach that metal. So that's not a big water quality concern depending on what you're storing the water in, making sure that it's not going to leach. pH was very commonly low. About 40% had low pHs. We didn't have any that had high pH. Over 30% had E. coli bacteria. Sediment was pretty common, and then less common were things like iron and manganese and total dissolved solids and sulfate. We even had one that had high lead, which was curious. We think that was related to the pipe that the water was coming from. It was a very old looking pipe, and it looked like it could have some lead in it. We didn't test it, but I think that's probably what was going on. It was a very corrosive spring. So overall, 91% failed at least one health-based standard, and the vast majority of those were bacteria. 6% of them failed for an aesthetic problem only. In other words, from a health perspective, they were safe to drink, but aesthetically, they weren't maybe all that great, which is kind of curious because a lot of people flock to them because they want the aesthetics. They want the good tasting water, and in this case, some of them didn't appear to be all that good tasting. Only one of the springs passed all of the drinking water standards, so 1 out of the 35. Now, I've done this talk for a fair number of public groups, and what do you think their number one question is when I'm done? Where is that one spring? Yes. I want to know where that one good spring is so I can go collect the water. And we won't tell them because that's not what we're trying to get people to do. And also, to point out, this is all based on one sample. One sample at one time. We could go back there and sample it again and find different water quality. That's one thing we want to look at next is take some of these springs and really intensively sample them and look at more things like Giardia and Cryptosporidium, see how much do they vary.
What time of the year did you test them?
They were anywhere between April. Most of them were in April and May. There were a few that we couldn't get to until later. The last one we did was actually in August, but I think roughly 30 of the 35, somewhere in that vicinity, were done in April and May. And that's important because seasonal differences in things like bacteria, as the water levels are higher, you tend to get higher incidence of bacteria, and as you get into summer, you might get lower incidence of that. So it does play an important role, I'm sure, in the water quality. And this is kind of hard to see, but this is for the 4 in Centr County. This is the water quality parameters, and the ones in red would be violations of a drinking water standard. So 3 of the 4 had low pH. The only difference would be the one going up up toward Orviston that had a high pH, or not high, but a good pH of 7.6. They all had coliform bacteria. Only one had E. coli, and it's that one that was a stream, basically. It was not a true roadside spring. The ones that were actually roadside springs, at least when we tested them, did not have E. coli. All of them were corrosive water, not too surprising. But other than that, they were generally pretty good. They had low levels of metals and other aesthetic problems, no nitrate to speak of, no barium, no lead. So from a health perspective, if you could get around the coliform issue and the 1 E. coli issue, they were generally pretty decent water supplies. That's all I'm going to say about the roadside springs, other than we are going to do more work this summer. We're going back, starting this spring actually. We're going to go back to a number of these springs, and we're going to test them much more frequently for more parameters to try to get an idea of how much they vary. We're going to try to interview people that are collecting water there, and we're going to also start to explore what kind of signage we might use on these, and think about perhaps putting signs out there for townships and PennDOT to use if they want to on these springs. So it's a potential protection against liability. The last couple things I'll mention, it's kind of interesting to me, and Todd and I have talked about this many times. I have a Gatesburg water well, and Gatesburg is one of the big groundwater formations in this area that provides a lot of the drinking water. And it's starting to get a little bit concerning about groundwater levels in this area, which is always unique. I think you coined the phrase invisible drought back years ago, maybe before the 2002-03 drought. And it's a very good term to use in this area, because droughts in this area, at least a groundwater drought, tend to be very invisible to people. I bet if you ask a lot of people right now if we're really dry, nobody would say we are, but yet we are. From a groundwater perspective, this is the data for the last 6 months, and we're actually getting pretty dry in this area, despite the fact that we just melted all that snow off and produced quite a bit of runoff, and the streams are normal or above normal, but groundwater levels are actually down pretty significantly. And this is the Gatesburg groundwater level, which I follow very closely because my well is in it, going back into the 1980s. And you can see it's gone through some pretty big swings. Here's the 2002, 2003 low during a drought. And this is where we're at right about now. We're down actually within about 6 feet of the all-time low. Now 6 feet's a lot in the Gatesburg, but still it's getting down to be a pretty low condition, and we really need some rain actually. So everybody start doing some rain dances here. We could really use rain in the next few weeks into April while we can still get it into the ground, because we could be setting ourselves up for a significant groundwater problem down the road here. The last thing I'll mention, we have a new app that we've developed. Of course, got to stay with all the new technologies out there. And we've been working on an app that will help private water system owners and people that deal with real estate to actually look at private water systems. So it helps identify problems in the water. It accesses all the water quality data at our lab so people can look at what are the most common issues in a certain area. It'll use the location of the phone to put you in touch with the nearest Penn State Extension person who can help answer questions. So it's called H2O Solutions, and it's going to be available on the Apple version within the next week or so. Actually, it should be ready after Friday. In Apple, you can find it on their store just by searching for H2O Solutions. And we're working on the Android version. It'll be available in the next couple months. So if you know people with private water systems, it might be helpful for them to diagnose what might be wrong with their water and to find help from local folks who can answer their questions. And then we have the Groundwater Symposium coming up in May. The Extension is one of the sponsors of, along with the Pennsylvania Groundwater Association and DEP. That'll be at the Ramada Inn. If you're not familiar with it, the website's here if you want to go on and look at the agenda. The Secretary of DEP will be doing the opening remarks, and then we'll have lots of different talks. Todd's giving a talk, among others, that have a lot of good information there. Paul Knight, the state climatologist, will be there to talk about how Pennsylvania is becoming drought resistant, which I just showed you we're going into a drought, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I agree with him. I think that generally speaking, droughts may become less prevalent statewide if we continue down the road of climate change. So if you're interested in that, the registration site's open for May 7th for the Groundwater Symposium. And this is our website. I have cards here if anybody wants one that have the URL. It's on the bottom of the slide too. All of our drinking water information is at that top link. If you're interested in any more of this, we put a lot of the reports from these projects. We have information on there from a lot of what I just talked about. It's available on that site. So any questions?